Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Dan Abella. I'm the organizer of the Philip K. Dick Film Festival. And today I'm very happy to have William Sarill here with us. Now, for those who are not familiar with William, let me share some of the information with you. William Sarill was a graduate student in physics and a film and music critic for Boston Papers at the time he first met Philip K. Dick in 1968. These days, he worked as a biochemist specializing in nutritional and anti-aging research. After meeting PKD at the World Science Fiction Convention in Berkeley, California, William was invited to live with PKD as his house guest for a month during the fall of 1968, at the time Dick's novel A Maze of Death was being written. Subsequently, they remained friends until PKD's untimely death in 1982, during which time they still stayed in touch by occasional phone calls, mails, and visits to the West Coast. Welcome, William.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, I first got on. I recently came across another article. This one, I think it was on the Guardian, and they kept promoting this idea that Phil's visions was a product of massive psychotropic drug use, which I only had to laugh when I heard that,
Right.
and quote unquote paranoid schizophrenia. So I
Right.
mean, I've known for long that's not been the case, but instead of me ranting and raving about how dishonest this information, I want to bring you to someone, to our audience, who really lived with Phil, who knew him very well for many, many years. So I just want to backtrack a little bit to the very first moment, how you guys met originally, and maybe we
Mhm.
can take it from there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'd been a fan, a science fiction fan in general. I think the very first Philip K. Dick story I ever read was Contact in Galaxy in, I think it was June or July of 1953. Scared the bejesus out of me. I didn't read any, I was pretty young at that time. I didn't read anything else of his for a few years. And then later on in the 50s, when I was in high school, I read, first I read, I think, The World That Jones Made, which was also interestingly creepy in places, and later Eye in the Sky. Then what happened in the 60s was I really became interested in his work after reading Man in the High Castle, Time Out of Joint, and so forth. So I greatly appreciated his style, his method of really creating mainstream, a sort of a mainstream envelope for science fiction ideas. You could read about characters that interpersonal relationships between married couples, usually the very damaged relationships, that you wouldn't see in any other science fiction of that period. I was intrigued by the verisimilitude of his writing, and it felt like he was writing in a novelistic style that it was very unusual for science fiction. And I appreciated the breadth of his ideas. I appreciated his sense of humor. I liked his spiritual input. I mean, there were a bunch of us who regarded him as kind of a spiritual mentor at a certain point in the 60s. We all got introduced to Taoism and the I Ching through The Man in the High Castle. So, of course, I'd been friends with many other science fiction fans, editors, writers, people like the late Terry Carr, who was living in California at the time, and Terry and his wife at the time, Miriam, were friends with Phil. At one point in probably around 67 or thereabouts, I mentioned to Terry how much I admired Phil's work, and I wanted to write to him. And Terry said, he's totally approachable. He's just, he's another fan, and he hangs out with a lot of fans as well as being a writer. So I got his address, wrote him some notes. I wrote him about a 3-page letter that he really responded to, wrote back to me. And then in the summer of 1968, I was attending a summer institute in theoretical physics at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I had a critical decision to make. I was either, when the summer institute was over, I was either going to hitchhike out to California to protest at the Democratic National Convention, or I was going to head to California and attend the World Science Fiction Convention. Well, I made the right choice, and my life changed as a result. If I'd gone to Chicago to protest, I would have had my head broken into. But instead, I went to California, wound up living with Phil Dick, and had my head broken into in a different way. So it was quite a revelatory experience that changed certain aspects of my life forever. I'm really glad I made that choice.
Well, he certainly mentions you in the foreword to the Maze of Death as
Right.
as an inspiration for the work. And how did that came about?
Well, you have to understand, it was we had like a month-long extended rap session or bull session, usually late at night after his wife Nancy had gone to bed. And Phil was a night owl anyway. He'd stay up till at least 1 or 2 in the morning. We stayed up talking for hours, and then I'd finally get tired to go to sleep. He'd stay up the rest of the night. We're working on manuscripts, um, but we had just a very free-ranging discussion of philosophy, physics, spirituality, Taoism, you name it, Irish folk tales, uh, books that he loved, poetry that he liked. It covered everything. And both of us were, shall we say, interested in theology. For him, it was a more urgent concern in some sense. He really devoted himself to it. I was an interested observer with a deep appreciation for philosophy. So we'd get to talk a lot. We'd talk about uh, the kind of thing you would get in a stoned rap session with a roommate at
Mm.
college, except when neither of us was stoned. We weren't high on anything, no psychotropic drugs. We were just high on each other. And we would talk about let's invent a new theory of God, that kind of thing. It was play. There was no intention to create something broader than that. But yet, about some months, it must have been later that year in '68. Phil called me. I was living in I was living in Berkeley at that time, and later moved to San Francisco in early February of 1969. So we were in touch by phone when I wasn't visiting him at his place in San Rafael, California. And he told me, well, I've written this novel, A Maze of Death, in which I've incorporated some of the ideas that we talked about. Um, the philosophical, spiritual, Gnostic underpinnings of the theoretical background behind Maze of Death.
Mm.
And I said, wow, that's great. I look forward to reading the book. It didn't come out till 1970. And I think at that point I was back on the East Coast. And tell you the truth, the when I first read the book, I didn't like it
Mm.
because it looked like Phil had to write like crazy in order to support his various wives and children, and he wasn't getting paid that much in those days. He didn't become really famous and start developing a more substantial income until very late in his life. But he had to keep churning out books, and a lot of them had ideas that were retreads. I thought Ubik was an almost perfect book,
Mm.
and I thought that Maze of Death was kind of like a cross between an Agatha Christie, in fact, her story, 10 Little Indians, I think it was, where you're trying to figure out who the murderer is by the last one standing. It was a cross between, it was a science fiction religious mystery novel that was kind of difficult to pigeonhole, that had elements in it from all his other books. There's some I Ching in it. There's the his religious speculations. There's an Ubik-like situation. I don't want to give any spoilers here, but everybody's either dead or they're hallucinating a shared reality, which you see again and again in his stories and Eye in the Sky as well, and in other other books of his. So I didn't like it that much. It took me a while to appreciate it, and I like it a bit better now than I did back in those days. But it was it wasn't primo material, and I think Jonathan Lethem published it together with the first tier books in his Library of America series of Dick's novels, and I think it was more, to me, it was more second tier. It's some good material in it. His description of an acid trip was, which apparently was authentic,
Right.
was quite impressive, and so I've had mixed feelings about it. But the actual, I took a look at his notes, which were preserved in some archive, about the foundation of the religion that he described in Amazing Death, and I couldn't see much relationship between that and what we originally had talked about. So he'd been writing the book before I arrived. He continued writing it after. He must have turned out the whole thing in a couple of months, and I appreciate the fact that he thinks I contributed to some extent to it. What was wonderful for me was just the give and take, the conversation of scintillating ideas. I think it was when I was interviewed by Lawrence Sutin in the early '80s for his book Divine Invasions, biography of Philip K. Dick. I basically said that Phil did all the talking and my contribution was minimal, which is not quite accurate. I was having an uncharacteristic fit of modesty at the time. It was more, he knew a lot more than I did, but we would engage in a constant dialogue and interchange that would help illuminate things for both of us. So although he was the idea man, I kept asking him questions and helping to shape his thought in some fashion.
One thing about his writing in Ubik and some of the other works is this almost as stream of consciousness aspect. I remember when I first started reading Ubik, after the 10th page, my mind was already feeling a little bit disjointed. So I was wondering to myself, I'm used to reading science fiction, so I started reading the words themselves, and I realized that sometimes the words don't each individually don't make sense, but from a larger perspective, they kind of impact my psychological frame of mind. Was that part of his idea? Or was this just simply because he was writing so quickly he didn't bother to edit his work?
It's a combination of things. Certainly, he would write very fast. I think he could type 120 words a minute.
Wow.
And you asked about, you mentioned psychotropic drug use before.
Right.
There was a period when during the 50s, I guess during the early 60s, but before I met him, when he was using or abusing methamphetamine. Not methamphetamine, Benzedrine, which is a different amphetamine. Meth was not really that common in those days, not like it is now. So I want to get that clear. He did take that. Originally, I think it was because of his asthmatic condition, but of course he found that it revved him up and gave him a lot. It provided some more fuel for his creativity so he could keep churning out material. Sometimes that material was great. Sometimes it didn't quite hold together. There are some of his early books, his early works that aren't particularly good, Vulcan's Hammer, for example, or what he did, what eventually became Lies Incorporated, I've forgotten the original title, that was put together in sort of a slapdash fashion. And he did repeat themes a lot, and he recycled stories, short stories, that turned into novels, which happened in the days of Perky Pat and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and so forth. Nevertheless, there was enough really, really good stuff to make it worthwhile. Now, some of what he did was, I wouldn't call it exactly stream of consciousness, although he was an admirer of James Joyce and Joyce's style. But he was the kind of prose that he usually went for was more straightforward, like Hemingway. Or maybe Dashiell Hammett, nothing too highfalutin, not Shakespearean. Even though he's been referred to as the Shakespeare of science fiction writers, there's nothing Shakespearean about his writing. You'd call him the Hemingway of science fiction writers, maybe. But I think it was a combination of having to write really quickly and also having an incredibly fertile mind. I mean, the ideas would just constantly pop up, and he would integrate them. He would take notes. He would even his sense of humor was like that. He could. I think what many people appreciate about his books is his sense of humor, a fine sense of the absurd. And it shows. It's an aspect of his creativity that shows in all of his writing. With regard to other drug use, he never did any drugs during the entire period I stayed with him or visited him, with the exception, back in '68, the one drug he constantly used was nicotine. He used the snuff. It was Inch Kenneth and Dr. Johnson, I believe, from a snuff company, and it made an ungodly mess of his beard. But he liked to do it because previously he used to smoke cigarettes and drink scotch, but he had to give up the cigarettes because it gave him pyloric spasms. So he resorted to snuff instead, and that was his favorite psychotropic drug, which is not to say he didn't use other things occasionally. There are references in the exegesis where he, to an acid trip or having done, having smoked a joint or something like that. But I never witnessed any of that. That was pretty relatively infrequent. On the other hand, he hung out with a lot of people who were drug users, and he did have some drug experiences which informed his work, such as the acid trip in A Maze of Death. But beyond that, he did have drug experiences, but not of the kind that you're thinking of. He once had an accidental overdose. At least I think it was accidental, because it's hard to know what was going on with him at times, since he did occasionally have, because of his depression, he occasionally has suicidal tendencies. But I think this was accidental, where he took an overdose of an antidepressant called Temporal, and for about 3 days saw a huge looming evil face on the horizon, and which formed in part his inspiration for a brilliant but very dark story, Faith of Our Fathers, in the collection Dangerous Visions that Harlan Ellison assembled. Now, Ellison had said, I want you to write a story on the influence of LSD, which Phil didn't do. But he did write a horrific vision. I assume you're familiar with the story of...
Yes. In fact, that's when he went to see Pike, Bishop Pike, and he became a Christian, and he felt this was a face of Satan or some kind of evil demiurge.
Yeah, I'm not sure at what point he connected with Pike. I think that was, let's see, that story is published in '67. Yeah, I think so. He'd met Nancy before then, who was the daughter of Pike's secretary, and he'd married Nancy by the time I was living with him. A very sweet woman. She took good care of me when I was visiting him. But in any event, that was a very dark vision he had that was inspired by this accidental overdose.
Right.
In terms of, then the thing is, let's talk about his mental state for a moment. People have called him paranoid schizophrenic. He was paranoid. My opinion, he was not schizophrenic. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've known other psychiatrists who I've discussed his case with, including a friend of mine I introduced to a psychiatrist. I introduced him to Phil Dick on one visit in the '70s. And there are different opinions. I think the saying that he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy or temporal lobe psychosis doesn't quite match. Although there are people with that kind of condition often tend towards hyper religiosity, and also graphomania, extensive writing, which he certainly did after his revelations in the so-called 2374 mystical insights. Did a lot of that, but his mysticism didn't just depend on drug experiences. He was sort of born with it, a philosophical
Right.
Introverted guy. Well, he could be an extrovert too. That was the funny thing. He could switch from being, just enormously engaging in the life of the party to being very withdrawn, agoraphobic, and so forth. But the paranoia, I suspect, came in part from his years of using amphetamines. It definitely can worsen that. And I think he had a tendency towards that to begin with. As best as I can figure, based on discussions I've had with psychiatrists, it's most likely he had bipolar disorder,
Mm.
manic depressive. Most of the time he was in a depressed state. Once in a while he'd go manic, and
Right.
he could do a lot of writing in those manic states, and also, and I've seen him in both kind of conditions. Um, the only question that remains is whether he was manic. You can have manic depressive tendency and be highly neurotic, or you can be manic depressive. You can have manic depressive psychosis. The only question is, was he psychotic or not? There's no one who can answer that question now, because he'd have to be given an exam. However, based on what I know of him, of my conversations with other psychiatrists, my conclusion is that it's most likely he was severely neurotic, but not psychotic. But anybody can have a brief psychotic break and then go back to some form of normalcy. The fact he stayed up all night writing reams and reams of pages about what had happened to him after his mystical experience was not per se a sign of psychosis. To me, it's rather a sign of what we might call a spiritual emergence or
Mm.
spiritual emergency, when his own brain cracked open in February and March of 1974, and he received a huge download of
Right.
information, of light, whatever you want to call it, and eventually it totally reprogrammed his life, as you probably read about that
Right.
incident. And what happened after that, it gradually faded off, but he always sought to recapture the essence of that experience. He always wanted to get back to where he'd been in the promised land, when that brilliant, all those brilliant insights were flooding into him. And that's why he spent years later continuing to ask questions about, what did I experience? What does it mean? What is my connection to God? What is reality? And that's what the exegesis is really all about, a constant searching without answers.
It seems like he had some people would regard him as a fictionalizing philosopher. That it
Right.
that he would in fact, and his this obsession or interest in religion and Gnostic themes, and actually it's traced back to the very beginning. It's not after 2374, but you can see in his early writings. Would that be a fair assessment?
He was, certainly. Okay, let me put it this way. He was very well read in a very limited sense. I mean, he didn't go out much. He had his little home library, a set of Will Durant's books on philosophy, a
Oh yeah.
encyclopedia, philosophy, and so forth. And he read a lot of that, and he had a lot of background information on subjects that were interesting to him, on Gnosticism, for example, and pre-Socratic philosophers. Um, and he all of it went into, and whatever he read from science, from physics, for example, or even other material, he would read his wife, his fourth wife, Nancy, told me he would read the science supplements that came with the Sunday papers and try to keep up with what's going on. All of that information, his literary gifts, his insights, his philosophical, religious, spiritual insights, his whatever he read, all went into this giant hopper that from which he could pull out material. It's something that stayed in his, let's say, in his unconscious, that was present for him, so that he could draw on it in any of his later works. And I just want to mention briefly that what happened to him in 1974, his sort of mystical breakthroughs, is not terribly uncommon. That kind of spiritual breakthrough happens to a lot of people, but he was an unusually keen observer of what was going on, and with all of his background, could could constantly interpret and reinterpret what had happened. And it's quite a remarkable piece of writing, especially the first 150 pages or so, where the core of his ideas get expressed from his in the exegesis from what he experienced. But it was definitely informed by everything he'd read before, his interests in Manichaeism, for example, Zoroastrianism, a variety of heresies, and all that. It was then informed. He originally was brought up as a Quaker, but he became Episcopalian, or as he called it, Anglo-Catholic, once he'd met Pike and got inspired by that whole train of thought. Yeah, he told me at one point I think it was in '68, that he said, I and Tony Boucher are the two religious fanatics in the Bay Area. And Tony Boucher was the editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, who'd bought Phil's first story.
Were you at all familiar with his friendship with Robert Anton Wilson, whom he mentions?
Not really. That's something I can't speak much
Right.
to. I was aware of Wilson. I didn't really get that deep into what he was doing at that point. And I think I met Phil before before he really connected with RAW anyway. Yeah.
Now you wrote a paper, actually. Let's see if I can pull it up here, if I can have it. You wrote a paper on the certain. Let me see if I can find it. It may be a little bit hard for the audience, huh? Maybe this. Yes,
Right.
on Ubik, and you felt that the use of you spend it was I read the whole paper, and it's very you make an interesting argument that Ubik may have been an example of the idea of using Ubik would be an example of some precognitive skills or he had.
Well, it's interesting. I think Phil was precognitive. There's some evidence of that, especially in the stories in the exegesis, when he became aware of his son's previously undiagnosed hernia. It was, the boy eventually needed surgery when he was old enough to withstand it, but Phil had picked up on it first. And there were various other incidents that occurred, and really famous ones that Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences has described in one of his books, where he talks about how Phil met some people after he'd written the book Flow My Tears, the policeman said, and the people he met had the same names and had the same characteristics and same occupation as the people he'd written about a few years earlier. So it's a pretty good description of precognition. I felt that he was. I mean, let's face it. The world we're living in right now is a Philip K. Dick world. What does that mean? I mean, he predicted this world in a sense. We had the Internet of Things, which you see in Ubik, for example, or some of the just the way that advertising has become more intrusive.
Right.
The way that we live in a surveillance society at this point. His paranoia is well founded. Paranoia is not paranoia if it's real. So, in many ways, we're living in a Phil Dickian world, but more than that, we're living in a world of ontological uncertainty. And what I mean by that is, how can we trust reality when the world seems to have gone crazy? I mean, who could have predicted any of the events? Some of the events of the last 5 to 10 years are just so beyond what we would consider as normal that it's like something out of a novel. And the changes that are hitting the planet are accelerating. There's increasing ferment, there's increasing change, whether on a personal or a planetary level. People are going through a lot of changes, and he was predicting this years ago.
Yeah.
Whether it even mentioned Even in his book, Three Stigmata Palmer Eldritch, he has global warming with the temperature outside is too hot to bear without special precautions. So, he covered it all. Now, you could say that, okay, any science fiction writer can do that. You throw enough darts at a board, eventually a couple will stick. And yet there's something unique about his vision that
Yes.
seems to specifically apply to our present era, which is one reason why he's so popular right now, because he speaks to people who feel dislocated, who feel alienated from the general trend of society, who wonder what the hell is going on. And he always spoke to people who were disaffected or alienated, who were outsiders in a sense, whether psychologically damaged or damaged in some other fashion by the nature of society itself. So to that extent, he's I call him Saint Phil, in the same sense in which Jean-Paul Sartre referred to Genet as Saint Genet. It's there is something. I have this vision of this incredibly flawed man, because he was no saint by the conventional understanding, but he persevered.
Right.
He worked through his stuff. He grew. He developed physically. He developed spiritually, emotionally, and it's unfortunate we can't see what he might have turned into because he died at such a young age. And I consider at this point in my life, was it 53 when he died? That's pretty good. But what more can I say about that? He had a lot of flaws. He was very human, and he had a lot of wonderful things about him. He could be extremely warm. He could also be alienating, and he could be very kind. I think what drew him to me first was his compassion that he evinced in his writing. He talked about caritas, which is the Latin word for faith, hope, and charity in the Bible. It's caritas really means charity or care. It doesn't mean charity so much; it means caring. And Phil really cared for other people, and that compassion is what drove him. Compassion for others less fortunate than he was. He gave away money when he had it. That compassion for understanding others was his most redeeming quality, and it was an important quality for him because it plays such an important role in all of his books. I mean, the difference between an android and a human being, in theory, is their capacity for empathy. In reality, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, you see that some of the androids are more compassionate than some of the humans, which is a really interesting twist. But he claimed that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he had. You mentioned earlier that in our talk that he had a rock and roll singer in mind for the movie.
All right. Yeah. Phil liked a lot of female singers at that point. Crystal Gale, anyone who was dark haired, his constant pursuit of the dark haired girl. But he was particularly taken with Grace Slick of the Jefferson Airplane back in the late 60s. And he'd wanted her to play the part of Rachel Rosen in Androids. And he'd written the film treatment for that film, his version of it. And so when I was visiting Los Angeles, I was a writer at that point. I settled in San Francisco and in Berkeley for over a year, and was writing for an underground paper as well as for a paper back home in Boston. I gave up the physics for a while until I returned back home to finish my thesis. But in any event, I'd gone down to Los Angeles in October of 1969, about a year after I'd first met Phil, and I brought with me a copy of his film treatment for Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and gave it to Grace Slick. I met her at her motel a few days before the concert, and then attended the concert at the at the Forum in LA on Halloween. And she was definitely interested. She the group was kind of science fictional. They already had some stories, some songs that were based on stories. There was a story by John Wyndham that they'd turned into the airplane had turned into a song. So she was up for it, but nothing ever happened with the idea because the film remained in development hell for about 13 years more. It was in the hands of a guy named Herb Jaffe. And it wasn't until Ridley Scott got hold of it that the film could be made. And at that point, it was they needed someone else other than Grace Slick to play the role. But it was fun meeting her and seeing her response to it. Also, I went to a party with the airplane and various members of the rock and roll establishment. Some members of the Rolling Stones were there. The Eric Burden of the Animals and some members of the airplane. And at one point, Grace Slick stripped off all her clothes and went swimming in a lighted pool, went skinny dipping. When I told Phil about it, he was agog. I'm sure. I'm sure he wished he were there to witness that, since he had such a crush on her.
You actually contributed. You helped Phil a little bit with the Scanner Darkly as well, I understand.
Yeah, that was interesting. So Phil had written a book when he wrote Scanner, which is a very powerful book, and I think one of the best films that's ever been made out of it. One of his books was Richard Linklater's film of Scanner. Phil wanted to promote it as mainstream in some fashion, and so he told Doubleday that he knew various authors that he could get a publication blurb for, somebody who would read the book and then comment, oh, this is, some mainstream novelist who would read it and say, this is great. But then he confessed to me, he said, I don't really know anybody who could do that. Can you help? So I said, sure, send me some copies of the manuscript and I'll hand them out. So I got a bundle of manuscripts from Doubleday, which were Xerox copies of the original version of the novel, sent them out to various people, tried to get in touch with Kurt Vonnegut, sent one out to Donald Westlake, sent one copy out to Ray Mungo, who I used to know. He was involved with the Liberation News Service and was, had written a book, was that Famous long ago, I think, and was running a bookstore in the Pacific Northwest. And I thought he would be a good contact. Well, Ray sent it back and said, I can't read it. It's the character of Donna, played in the movie by Winona Ryder, is too sexist. So I had a talk with Phil over the phone. I said, well, you got a problem with this character. I mean, I agreed with Ray's assessment of the character. Donna, the way Donna's written is not very flattering, and it is rather sexist. Now, you have to understand about Phil that he had some complicated relationships with women. But the other thing about him is that he was always willing to examine himself. He always had that truth-seeking ability where he was willing to confront his own nature, his own failings, or what have you. So on the one hand, when I told him that some people thought this chapter, including me, was too sexist, a particular chapter in the book describing Donna, he took offense. And I didn't hear from him for about a month and a half. And then he called me up and he said, he was laughing. He said, I was so unhappy. I was sitting at a bar drinking and saying, he called me sexist. He called me sexist, mispronouncing it. He was offended by what I had suggested, but then he went ahead and rewrote the section. He also had guidance from Judy Lynn Benjamin, who was his editor at that time, I think. I know she was, she was later married to Lester Del Rey. I think she worked with Ballantine Books at one point, but whatever the story was, she was the one who helped reshape that chapter as well. And so the combination, whatever my input was plus hers, wound up with having Donna, the character in the book, turn into a much stronger portrait that wasn't sexist at all and that was appreciated.
Let's go back to a very interesting news conference, the one he's known for, the 1977 Mets, where ironically it's being taken off YouTube, or at least you can only see bits and pieces of it now. But it's very interesting to watch people's reactions as this is the first time he talks publicly about the idea that we're living in a simulation, in a computer generated matrix.
Right. Yeah.
And the reaction was absolutely priceless. Some of these people. Can you just share a little bit about? Because I believe you had the manuscript, right? Or you had the
yeah. It was. I didn't go to Metz, but I saw him the year before he left, and I saw him the year after he'd come back. I think he went in '77. He came back. I met him in '77 and in '78, and in the meeting in '78, he gave me the original manuscript that he'd written for that speech, which I later, after his death, I later turned over a copy to Paul Williams of the PKD Society, and Paul arranged for its publication by Doubleday in a collection of essays posthumously. What I understand from Philippe Hupp, that the talk that he gave in Metz was quite different from the manuscript he'd given me, although the ideas, you can still read it. If you find this world bad, you should see some of the others, I think was the essay, had a huge influence on me personally. And I know people at that time couldn't understand it or relate to it, but I found it to be totally revelatory. It had, as I said, it had an enormous influence on my thinking about the nature of reality, the nature of alternative worlds, and how this world gets selected to be manifested out of all the different possibilities, as he describes it, like God reaching into a closet to pick out a new suit, and like, maybe I'll try this one on today, that kind of thing. And of course, it was 22 years after the Met speech that the film The Matrix
comes out.
Because the Wachowski siblings created that film, and it was like a direct, almost like a direct translation of some of Phil's ideas that are present in the exegesis, the world as a computer program that could be arbitrarily changed, could be reprogrammed at any moment.
And what's amazing now is that this is the power of his idea, that now you have mainstream physicists who are actually suggesting that we might actually be living in, there is a possibility.
Simulation, yeah.
And that was 20 years ago that anyone would have thought that's just sci-fi, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I think this speaks to Phil's intuition. The idea of the universe or the laws of the universe being, in a sense, created as a computer program or as an artificial intelligence goes back to the digital physics of Konrad Zuse in 1967, Ed Fredkin later. I'm sure that Phil wasn't aware of any of those works or had read any of them. He arrived at this sui generis by himself. He somehow tapped into this deep understanding of how things work that I've later found support for in the writings of some of the digital physicists or people who are now talking about the simulation hypothesis. And of course, his whole thing about simulation was also of interest to philosophers as well, Jean Baudrillard in particular, his book on simulacra,
Right.
in which he references Phil's book on simulacra, but I don't think he understood it at all because it doesn't not really directly related to what Baudrillard was talking about. But the whole notion, I mean, the most to me, the most prescient aspect or precognitive aspect, whatever you want to call it, of Phil's understanding is that how much of the world that we live in, never mind being created as a computer simulation, how much of the world we're living in is a simulation, is fake, whether it's the news we read, the television we watch, the newspapers we fed, everybody. And in today, it's possible to create simulations of even on video of people
Right.
talking that are totally made up,
The fake
and that
video.
look completely real. So we're now at a point where how can we possibly tell what's real or what's not? As I alluded to before, it's an ontological crisis, and he foresaw that, which is remarkable.
And and he talks about the black iron prison.
Yeah.
This and I feel more than ever that we, in a way, the whole culture going culturally, we seem to be living this black iron prison, referring to disinformation, simulations, and confusion, which a lot of people just don't know. So, in his opinion, knowing him, uh, what was the way out of it? Was there a way? Empathy or compassion? What were his thoughts on breaking out of that?
Well, he had a specifically spiritual vision, and that was that the black iron prison was associated. I mean, in his mind, it seems almost quaint now, but in his mind, he associated the black iron prison with the Empire of Rome, which
Right.
the empire never ended. His famous quote, which was ongoing up until the Watergate situation, in which Nixon was eventually forced to give up the presidency, and according to Phil, then real time began again at that point. I don't know about that. I think it's Nixon was not exactly, even though his initials are RMN, which you can pronounce Ariman, who's the the force of darkness in the dualistic worldview, Ahura Mazda
Right.
versus Ahriman, which Phil was very much in tune with in his in one of his early novels. He wrote about a world like that. But it's not just that Nixon embodied some kind of evil. I think to Phil it was that he embodied a conspiracy. There was the
Mm.
paranoid. Again, my paranoia is real. There is a conspiracy, right? And
Right.
that he saw the possibility for radical freedom after after the truth had been exposed. In reality, we've had to slog through many more years of creating additional falsehoods, and
Right.
we're waiting for yet a further break out of the black iron prison that we're deeply enmeshed in.
Did
But
did did Phil what were Phil's thoughts on the Kennedy assassination? Did he feel it was a part of a larger cabal of assassins, or it was just a CIA driven initiative, or was it just
I'm not positive about that. I'd have to go look at some of my sources. I know that let's see, I think he ended his relationship with Anne around that time, before or after. I don't know. I do know that he was pretty nuts during the period afterwards, around 64, 64, 65. He was doing a lot of amphetamines, running around with guns, and with his buddy J.K. Newcomb. But I don't know. I'm not sure to what extent he felt that the Kennedy assassination was part of the whole scene. It wouldn't surprise me if he was. If that were the case, but we really didn't talk about that. We did talk about other aspects of politics, however, and Phil. It's interesting. It's Phil. It's very hard to pigeonhole him in many different ways, including, there are people who want to own him as a liberal. There are people who want to own him as a conservative. Um, On the conservative side, or at least libertarian side, I mean, he's opposed to government in general, to government surveillance,
Right.
in particular to he was anti-abortion, but that came out of his religious views. I mean, it's I can't fault him for that. That was his own personal choice, even if he wrote stories about it that offended Joanna Russ. But beyond that, his views were, he's basically saw himself as a blue collar kind of guy, and
Right.
all of his heroes like Joe Chip are basically blue collar kinds of guys, not intellectuals and so forth. And he was, for example, he was a supporter of, in general, of liberal movements, in particular of. He was greatly interested in Dorothy Day's socialist workers movement.
Mhm.
It was a Catholic workers movement, I believe,
Yeah.
where she combined social concern with religious concern. That was an influence on him. He famously signed when a group of conservative authors published an ad saying, "We support the Vietnam War," a group of more liberal authors came out with a separate ad saying, "We are opposed to the Vietnam War." He was in that signed up in that second list. And he also refused to pay his taxes to the IRS because he didn't want it to support the war, at which point the IRS seized his car, which didn't help any. So generally he was liberal, but you could say it was liberal on many social issues, not about abortion, but definitely otherwise deeply concerned about government control and intrusion. And that probably goes back to the early 50s when he and his wife Cleo were approached by the FBI and asked to attend the University of New Mexico and spy on other students. And that was his second wife. And from that point on, he had a deep suspicion of the FBI in general and of government interference in particular. Yeah.
So what he classify, what you say was in the classic original sense of libertarian, not in the way it's viewed today, not today's libertarians, but in the more original sense.
I would say so. There's a really interesting interview with him that was done late in his life, in which he talked about some of his political views, and in which he said that he believed that the Civil War was wrongly conducted, that it would have been better if the South had gone their own way. I mean, you can argue about that, but he felt that states' rights had some importance. So is that a classic libertarian position?
Mm-hmm.
Probably. But as far as that goes, I don't think he thought through far enough about the consequences
Right.
of what would have happened had the South been allowed to peacefully separate from the Union. He did acknowledge that it would lead to that things might be difficult for blacks at first, but eventually it might get better. But more than that, the South would have been a natural ally for the Germans in World War II, and then the whole story of Man in the High Castle comes to mind. It would have been a very different outcome if that had happened. So maybe it was just as well that some of Phil's visions didn't happen the way they did, or we might all be speaking Deutsch. It's but so you can call him a libertarian, a liberal libertarian, and maybe
Right.
covers
Well,
it.
it's interesting. The Man in the High Castle, as opposed to the movie series, kind of like ends abruptly without. And I understand that Phil, after a while, just felt revolted by having to really keep on recreating this alternative reality where Nazis run basically America and Europe. Was that the reason it ends? Because a lot of people say
It's interesting. I had some talks with him about that book specifically. I mean, he told me he had, in fact, what he said, he did 5,000 separate plot decisions using the I Ching to determine how the story was going to work out. But I did mention that there were some parts of it, particularly the book, within the book, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, I thought were relatively hastily written or poorly written compared to the rest of the book. And he acknowledged that he'd had to make some changes and also that the order of the ending, the order of the chapters had been rearranged. And I think I don't mind the fact that it seems to just stop, but it seems like a more natural progression might have been
Right.
leading up to the moment that Juliana visits the man in the high castle himself. It's a more logical ending after that point. Either way, it kind of stops short. But I love the book no matter what. I can't tell you how many.
Absolutely. These 5,000 plot lines, how did he decide which one to go with? Was it his use of the I Ching? Is that he would
Yeah,
use it?
yeah, he would toss the coins, and I witnessed him doing a lot of consulting the I Ching while I was there, and on all kinds of questions. But he claimed he made that many plot decisions. Paul Williams kind of doubted that it was that many, but it was an exaggeration. He was pretty good at exaggerating at times,
Right.
or let's say expanding reality. His version of what reality was. His third wife and Dick said that he used to lie all the time, but on the other hand, some of the most outrageous stories that he told turned out to be true, and he would just lie about inconsequential things as well. I attribute that to the enormous creativity of this guy. It's almost like he lived in multiple alternate realities at once because he was constantly creating different perspectives on them. Most famously, when his home at 707 Hacienda Way was broken into by forces unknown, and his safe blown apart around in the early 70s. And he came up with like 5 different theories about who had done it, including one theory that he'd done it himself. you know, it could be. I mean, it's there.
Well,
Nobody really knows.
he certainly falls in the tradition of a lot of highly creative artists who create this world and step into it, and sometimes lose.
Yeah. I will say that. And let me mention, if I don't know if we've got time, I'll mention something else too.
Sure.
I've looked closely at his personality profile, and something I'm planning on writing a paper about. I've talked about it occasionally. The source of his creativity, as I said, he didn't have temporal lobe epilepsy or temporal lobe psychosis. He wasn't crazy in my estimation, but he had a quality that I call temporal lobe lability. That's a term the neuroscientist Michael Persinger came up with, and others, not just Persinger. But the idea is that people like this can be deeply spiritual or religious people, advanced meditators, and so forth. They can go into these, have paranormal experiences, and so forth. And it's that most electrically labile part of the brain, the temporal lobes, get excited. At the far end of the spectrum, you see temporal lobe epilepsy or psychosis. But you can have relatively normal people who just happen to be spiritually devout or advanced meditators who can have those kinds of experience. This is the awareness of a numinous presence around them, which he frequently had, or all kinds of events of that sort. That there's an overlap among 4 different psychological traits that are characteristic of people with paranormal beliefs. One of them is temporal lobe epilepsy. One of them is schizotypy, which, again, at the far end of schizotypy is schizophrenia. He wasn't schizophrenic, but he did have some schizotypal characteristics. He could typically more of an introverted form. And people like that tend to be extremely creative. Likewise, there's a connection between his depression or his possibly mania and depression, again, with creativity, but also with the phenomenon of transliminality, which has to do with crossing boundaries.
Right.
And that would mean material coming from the environment or from his deep subconscious or deep unconscious would get expressed into consciousness. That's why when he got triggered off by whatever happened to him during his spiritual revelations, he could draw on this unconscious wealth of material he'd studied for years, and it all suddenly fit together and made sense for him. And then the fourth one was apophenia, which is the ability to derive meaning from random events. And anybody who uses the I Ching is doing that, or anybody who picks up information from cosmos in that fashion. So these four overlapping traits they fit him like a glove. And it's very typical of people who claim to have paranormal experiences or mystical experiences, and people who tend to be very creative. And I think that goes to the heart of his situation, that he was an intensely creative individual with this background. The paranoia came along for the ride with the rest of it. The essence was the creativity. And that's what we most value Phil Dick for.
Right,
It's
right.
that wild creativity, that tremendous vision that still has resonance today.
There's almost a prophetic quality about his writing that is very tangible. And I cannot help but think that some of these experiences that the medical world likes to refer to as anomalous or are something we should have more of, more ecstasy, more epiphany, more religious visions, because it seems like a lot of people seem to be lost in the world. And you mentioned that Phil, after his 2374 experience, he wanted to recapture that moment of bliss, of grace, or
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it.
Transcendence, yeah.
Transcendence. And that's something that I think all of us could benefit for more in this day and age of mechanization and aromatic consciousness. I just wanna take a couple of minutes here. I have a few questions people have asked, if you don't mind. One fellow mentioned, you might be familiar with this, that Ubik, there is an Arabic translation, is I am Ubik, before the universe was I am. There is the father in Arabic, Google translation from the Arabic is Ubik, father. Uh, Before the universe was and I am, I made the suns, I made the worlds, I created lives and places. Do you think Phil might have been familiar with Arabic or some more esoteric translations of that?
He was into Sufism. I know that much.
Okay.
Yeah, but indirectly, I'm not sure to how deep his knowledge of Sufism lasted, but he was definitely influenced by some of the great Sufi thinkers. And trying to remember if that included Ibn Arabi or not sure. So,
Okay.
but there were, he took in everything.
He's sure that he's so rare as a writer. When I read him, it's really enjoyable. That's why we've done PKD Talks, because I think that in a weird way we're trying to perpetuate that tradition of bringing in different thinkers and writers, and because the world is too specialized now, and we're kind of losing sight of the big picture. High tech, cryptocurrency. I mean, this is maddening. Yet the bigger picture, I don't see too many people who are able to connect the dots across the board. So, one last question is: it is sad to see that Phil would maybe the last year of his life he came into some funds as a result of the movie Blade Runner, or at least the rough cuts or advance he was given. But most of his life, he really did not live financially that well. What were his thoughts on seeing the cut, the rough cut, I would say, the dailies, as I understand?
Well, he had some famous disagreements with Ridley Scott because he wanted the book was changed markedly in order to make it into a film, and it's really a separate work of art. It's it's you can't really say that the film is directly a film of the book, but nevertheless, the visuals, which what he saw, he said that's exactly what I saw. In other words, the scenes of this LA of the future, which is actually the present. We've caught up with it at this point. To him, looked like the dystopian future that he was trying to envision, and so that part at least he was pleased with. But he never got to see the entire film, and I suspect he would have been displeased with the totality of it because it differed so much from his vision. And of course, he even famously refused to write the novelization of it because it would have been a different book from Do Androids Dream, Electric Sheep. He was I don't want to call him a purist exactly, but he was he had literary standards that were very important to him. He took himself seriously as a writer, and he was not by any means a sellout.
Right.
And that's part of his legacy as well. This sort of iron-bound ethical standard as an author, and he stood up for other authors as well. You know, for the integrity of their work. I think that says a lot about him as well.
Certainly would. He will be, even though Hollywood is not, in a weird way, Hollywood has continued because it's getting people to go back to his original work. So even though his adaptations, with the exception of Scanner Darkly, are kind of ridiculous, in a strange way, they're, you know, the people who are into it say they're more fascinated by his ideas will go back to the original works. And that's where I see a redeeming quality to that as well. Well, William, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I think people who've seen this, and will definitely include any information on the bottom here of the talk, but it's been great. I think a lot of people hopefully will dispel some ideas who this Philip K. Dick guy is, because a lot of people will say, even though he's known in France, when I've done the festivals there, people are familiar, and in Eastern Europe, like Poland, we did 2 festivals in Poland, and they know him. They were well attended. So
yeah.
But thank you again for your time and for sharing. I think it's great. I think Phil, wherever he is, he's looking down kindly on us.
Thank you. I miss him.
Yes, we'll thank you again, and we'll stay in touch, and we'll definitely let's do one other one maybe in the fall.
All right, take care.
Thanks.
Nice to talk to you.
Good. Bye-bye. Well, folks, this brings us to another segment of PKD Talks. Hopefully you've enjoyed this very enlightening and fascinating talk with William Sarill on his friendship with Philip K. Dick. Please like that button and subscribe to our channel. We hope to bring more people, more writers and thinkers in the weeks and months to come. So you guys enjoy. God bless, and we'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.